Welcome back to part 2 of winter birds and feeder birds. Today we're going to concentrate on songbirds that you can find at a feeder. Most of these are resident species, so not only will you find them at the feeder, I'll share with you which habitat areas you can find these birds on. The first pair of species that I'm going to talk about are our Ohio State bird, the cardinal. Now, first I'll talk about the male and then I'll talk about the female. One thing about the cardinal, very thick, heavy, finch-like bill. Most all the finches, because they open up seed of various kinds, can crack open a seed because of their extremely powerful finch-like bill. Both have that. The cardinal, obviously very conspicuous because of its bright red, cadmium red coloration, for the most part with the little black facial area around the base of the bill and right before the eye. The cardinal is a very versatile bird. It will occur in just about any kind of habitat, whether it's urban or suburban areas, forest tracts, any edge ecotone type of habitat is typically where you'll find the cardinal. So it's a very common bird throughout the state. Again, the male is bright red. The female, on the other hand, they are sexually dimorphic. The female, in comparison, it's not that it doesn't have any red on it, but mostly it's this green, kind of greenish brown coloration here, especially around the hair there, with tinges of red. Red being on the wing itself, and a little bit on the tail. You see the red. The bill is not quite as brightly colored as the male, not quite as orange red as the male is. It does have some red on the forehead and the top notch area. Right, both species are, again, forest species. You want to refer to the PowerPoint that's on the Moodle site, which I talk about not just the description of the birds, but also the songs. And the cardinal is a very vocal bird, and you will hear it throughout the spring and summer. All right, so that's the first pair of birds. The second bird is also very common, and that's the blue jay. The blue jays are not sexually dimorphic, at least you cannot tell that in the field. It's one of our few blue coloration birds, the blue mostly being created by light and so forth, but it's blue with them black bar markings on the wings and a little bit on the tail, right? The breast area is more or less a white coloration, and there's a black little necklace that goes across the upper part of the chest. There's some black markings also through the eye and around the forehead area. The blue jay is considered a forest species, but again, like the cardinal, it's adapted to just about any kind of habitat. You'll find it in forest tracts, you'll find it in urban, suburban areas. It is a corvidae, which it means it's related to the crow. Sometimes the Native Americans call it the blue crow. It's a little bit larger, about the same size, maybe a little larger than a robin. The male and female are more or less identical. Two other species that are very common at the feeders, especially during the wintertime, is the tufted titmouse and the Carolina chickadee. Now, the Carolina chickadee, there are two species that occur in Ohio. The Carolina chickadee occurs in the southern two-thirds of the state, and the black-capped chickadee occurs in the upper third of the state. Otherwise, they look very similar in coloration and feather patterning. Their songs are different, though. The song of a Carolina chickadee is 4-part. The song of a black-capped chickadee is 2-part. They do get their names from the call called chickadee-dee-dee, which one is singing in the background here, if you can hear it, singing. The Carolina chickadee is a cavity nesting bird, so it obviously occurs in forested tracts, along with the tufted titmouse, which is also a cavity nesting bird. Chickadees can be identified by their black cap, black throat, kind of overall grayish coloration on top, above, and then a little bit lighter below. Very small bird. You can see by the size of of the bird in my hands that chickadees are not very big. Very energetic, very lively, and very vocal, especially with the chickadee call. The actual song is not expressed as much as the chickadee call. The tufted titmouse, again, relatively small bird, a little bit larger than a chickadee. Can be identified by its kind of a gray, mousy coloration, okay, on top. It does have these, and you can see it here a little bit, the salmon on the flanks, sort of the salmon coloration on both the flanks, on both sides of the bird, which you can see sometimes in the field. It has this black forehead marking right here. It has a bit of a tuft as well. Fairly long tail in comparison to its body, which is more grayish color. Again, this is a forest species, although it occurs in suburban, urban areas in the wintertime. It frequents feeders, loves sunflower seeds. Both chickadees and titmouse will store their seed during the winter. Oftentimes you'll see them grab a seed, take off, and hide it in a crevice of a tree or even in shingles on a roof. They will remember where those seeds are located during the wintertime. A cavity nesting species as well is a tufted titmouse, very vocal. The song has been expressed as a Peter, 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 or hear, 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 kind of ringing throughout the forest track. One of the most common vocalizations you're going to hear in forest tracks throughout the state of Ohio, and they will sing even through the winter. You will hear tufted titmouses sing. The next bird is one of 3 wrens that we have in Ohio. The house wren, which is a migrant. The Carolina wren stays here year-round, and then we have the winter wren, which is a fairly rare species that occurs in the hemlock communities throughout the state. The Carolina wren is probably the most frequent one at a feeder, and one that occurs a lot around houses, urban areas, suburban areas. They nest just about anywhere. In fact, I had a pair that nested in my Jeep during the summer, behind the back seat. You never know where you're going to find a Carolina wren nest. Carolina wrens can be identified from the house wren. The house wren's a little bit smaller. It doesn't have, it's more of a grayish brown coloration, not so many markings on the house wren, but the Carolina wren is more of a rusty brown coloration on the back. It does have some black markings that go through the wing and the tail, a little bit light colored, again, in the breast area. The bill is down curved. If you look at the bill, it's moving down. It's not straight out. It's a down curved bill. They're primarily insect eaters, although they will forage for seeds and just about anything they can eat during the wintertime. They will come to the feeder. They particularly like suet during the wintertime. Now, one way you can tell, and you don't see it very much on the specimen here, but they have a black and white eyebrow stripe. It goes right above the eye there, which is one good way of telling them from other wrens, particularly the house wren, which is the other common wren that we have in Ohio. So that's the Carolina wren. It also, again, it will nest in a variety of different locations. You'll find it in forest tracts like the one right behind me, or you'll find it in urban, suburban areas as well. The next feeder bird we have, and a fairly common, these are all resident species in Ohio. And what I mean by resident is all these species stay in Ohio year-round. So they're here during the winter, they're here in the spring, summer, fall, so they're considered resident species. We have about roughly around 30 resident species in Ohio. The rest of the species that nest here are migrants that come into Ohio during the spring and stay here during the summer and then leave sometime in the fall, which we'll be getting into later on this semester. This is an eastern towhee. This is an eastern towhee female. I didn't have a good male specimen. Really, you see the males more often than you see the females. The males are really striking in color. They're like a charcoal black, where the female here is brown. You see the brown here on the female. On the male is black. The fronts, usually there's a chestnut sided color here that's a little more intense on the male. In the flank area on each side of the belly, you see this really chestnut coloration in the black. And then the entire back of the male would be black, and then they have these white spots on the tail. The female is more of a brownish coloration. Towhees, even though you find them around forest tracts, are more like a forest edge species. what we call an educative species, where there's brushy habitat is typically where you'll find eastern towhees. But normally they are connected with forest areas. And also in thick brushland areas. The eastern towhee has a very conspicuous song. At one time, it was called the chewink bird. The males actually do this paired phrase, chewink, 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 which is used as much as the actual drink your tea song as well. Both those songs are used. Even during the winter, I've heard towhees do the drink your tea song when you have overwintering birds. But they're a very common caller. You should not mistake the towhee when you're out in the field. Drink your tea sounds very much like the song, and the chewink sounds very much like the song as well. So that's the eastern towhee. The two more species I want to cover in this little episode of the video. This is a eastern bluebird, and this is, of course, the male. The male is brightly colored blue with some rusty coloration on the chest and into the belly region. The bluebird female is a little bit duller in coloration than what the male is. More of a kind of grayish brown coloration. It does have some blue in it though. Bluebird populations at one time declined because of the lack of nesting cavities. They're a nesting cavity species. And the lack of dead snags and available cavities and in competition with other cavity nesters like the starling sort of displaced the bluebird. The population declined. But because of the efforts of many citizen conservationists putting out nesting boxes, the bluebird has recovered. And populations are pretty stable, and they're a fairly common bird once again in Ohio. Bluebirds, even though they're cavity nesting species, they hunt for insects typically in grassland areas. So oftentimes you'll find them nest on the edges of forest tracts where the available cavities are at, if they're using a natural cavity, and then hunting out in the grassland areas for, like in the summertime, for grasshoppers. I've checked nesting boxes during the summer where there'd be piles of grasshopper legs in the bottom of the nesting box from all the grasshoppers who are fed to the young over the time that they're raising their young in the box. Again, the eastern bluebird has made a tremendous comeback, and it's as common today as it has been for the past 25 years. The next and last bird I have, which is really a common bird at feeders, particularly thistle feeders, is the American goldfinch. The American goldfinch, the male and females both look like this during the winter. They have sort of a yellowish green coloration. The males typically will have a little bit more yellow in the winter and black here in the facial region, okay, than the female during the winter. But they look pretty much alike during the winter, and then by spring comes, the males will start developing a bright cadmium gold yellowish coloration throughout, and the wings will become more intense black. And areas where there was black, it's much more intense during the spring and the summer than it is during the winter. The female will not change in coloration. They will remain the same, sort of this olive greenish coloration throughout. The American goldfinch, it nests about the same time that thistle blooms in Ohio. They use thistle down oftentimes to line the inside of their cup nest. They like to use small shrubs, brushland areas where you typically find them nesting. And that's why a lot of people would call me up and say, hey, where'd all my goldfinches go to the summertime? And they've left the feeder and they're out nesting in areas where there's available nesting habitat. The American goldfinch, again, very common bird throughout the state of Ohio. It is adaptable to many different types of habitat, but its preferred nesting habitat is more of a brushy fence row or a woodland edge or an edgecotone brushland type of habitat where there's ample insects for it to feed its young during the summer. And then come fall, the birds will return to the feeder and feed heavily on thistle seed, although they will also will take sunflower and millet as well. So that's the American goldfinch, and that concludes our video on the winter and feeder birds, including those birds that are resident in the state of Ohio. There are other bird species that you find at feeders during the winter that are not resident species or nesting species in Ohio, such as the junco and the white-throated sparrow. Those species are very common at the feeder, but only stay here during the winter and then leave and go north. Typically, they're boreal forest species. So the next video that I will install will be the one for Lake Logan, and that will be for next week.